Hello, everybody. My name is David Chinery, and I'd like to welcome you once again to one of our webinars here today, our Lunch in the Garden series. And before I forget, I should say that we are not going to be having one next week or maybe the week after. So we're going to take a little break and do some other things, but we will be coming back a little bit later in the summer. So watch your email and watch your Facebook page or our Facebook page, and we'll let you know when we're going to come back. So today we're going to talk about some ways to manage weeds in lawns and landscapes. And I imagine some of you are going to have questions. So if you want to type your questions in the chat box, Marcy's going to keep an eye on that for us. Marcy is our administrative assistant who does everything from practically change the oil in the cars to running the web pages. So she does all sorts of things for us today, and she's our co-pilot. So she's going to be keeping an eye on the chat box and will help me with the questions at the end. So if you do have any questions, you can type them up and then we'll get to them at the end. Okay, so we're going to talk about weeds, and of course this is a hot topic this time of the year, and hopefully you can see my little graphic here. We should have never waited this long. Now the weeds have completely taken over. It's the weeds are taking over this time of the year. So I really like that little cartoon. I use that every time I give a weed talk. And I've been thinking about weeds a lot because we spend a lot of our time gardening, actually weeding, rather than maybe doing some of the more fun things. And I think we should try to be smart about what we do. So not maybe going down the wrong path with a certain weed or expecting a certain weed control tactic to work when it's probably not going to. So that's what I'm going to focus on today, some of the different strategies that we have for managing weeds and which ones you might use in which situations. Of course, it's going to take a little more research on your part because you may have different weeds than I talk about today. So of course, we always start out a weed talk with what is a weed? A weed is a plant out of place. A weed is a plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. Or actually nowadays, a weed is often a plant whose virtues have been forgotten. A lot of our weeds of today were actually plants that were useful years ago and have fallen out of use and just are kind of a nuisance at this point. Weeds can be unsightly, unattractive, taking up space in a garden, competing with a crop, and maybe making things look kind of ugly. And weeds in general will grow aggressively and reproduce prolifically. So they don't get to be weeds just by being demure wallflowers sitting on the side of the garden. They tend to be aggressive and fill in spaces. So I like to think about what weeds I have and get to know those weeds. So some weeds might be more bothersome to you than other ones. And for me, I put this PowerPoint together kind of very much in my point of view here today. I like clover on my lawn, and partly that's because I'm a beekeeper, or actually at this moment an ex-beekeeper, and I really like bees and pollinators. And I don't really mind dandelions for the same reason. The clover really is a good pollinator plant, and the dandelions are important in the spring for the pollinators, and the dandelions especially kind of go away after they do their thing. But I don't like a plant called broadleaf plantain, which I'm going to show you some pictures of today and talk about how you might manage. And I never knew until a few years ago when I went to get allergy tested that broadleaf plantain is actually a very allergy producing, or the pollen produces a lot of allergies in people. And I happen to be very allergic to it. So I would like to have less broadleaf plantain. I'm battling garlic mustard, which I'll show you in the woods behind my house. I have invasive lily of the valley, an invasive campanula, which is a kind of a thug in my rock garden, and I'll show you pictures of that. And then a plant called birthwort, or Aristolochia, and that's a picture of it here on this this page here. It's a very odd kind of plant. It has a really pungent, obnoxious smell. It kind of pops up here and there, and I bought it from a rock garden catalog who was selling it, a specialty nursery. And I've really disliked this plant ever since. It really kind of runs underground, has a big rhizome system, and I've been trying to get rid of it for a long time. So what weeds are bothering you? Learn about those weeds and make your own short list. So that's kind of what I'm here today to help you think about, is making your own weed short list and what direction you want to go with that. So get to know your weeds, the annual, winter, annual, biennial, or perennial life cycle. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on going over those today. I'll let you look up those terms in horticulture if you don't know them already. The annual, of course, just lives for 1 year or 1 season. The perennial sticks around for a long time. The biennial is here for 2 years. So get to know those life cycles and what life cycle your particular weed has. How does your weed reproduce? Do you need to worry about seeds? Not all the time do you really have to worry that much about seeds. That birthwort plant, which I just showed you, doesn't really reproduce that much from seed. It's really got underground rhizomes or a root system that spreads. So some weeds reproduce greatly by seeds. Maybe it's less important with others. And again, what type of roots do you have? How does it spread and move about? And that, with a lot of weeds, I think in gardens, that tends to be a big issue because we get these weeds with big root systems that we can't completely dig out, and then we have to resort to some other means. So each type of garden setting and each weed will have to be managed in its own way. And always think about, again, what weeds can be tolerated. I once saw ground ivy sold in hanging baskets in a nursery in California. And I thought, wow, maybe they have the right idea. They've taken this weed and put it in a hanging basket and are selling it for $12.95, and now it's an ornamental. So sometimes maybe we can tolerate things. So it's all about your perception. Okay, some garden plants have become weeds, so I threw a few of these up here. Gout weed, we get a lot of questions about that. I had a question about that just before this webinar started. How can I get rid of that? So we'll touch on that briefly. It's a very attractive plant in its own way, but it's planted as a ground cover. It spreads and you never get rid of it. The bloodroot I brought from a wooded area and put it in my garden, and I wouldn't call it a weed really yet, but it has spread a lot, and I kind of have enough bloodroot now, but it keeps going. The 5-leaved Akebia is a vine, and that is a very aggressive vine. I wish I hadn't planted. So beware of that. A lot of these nursery plants can be a little aggressive sometimes, and they don't necessarily tell you that on the tag. And then the picture down at the bottom of the winged euonymus, unfortunately my neighbor planted a very large hedge of that. It's an invasive plant according to New York State, but it's still being sold. And now I am finding winged euonymus seedlings in my woods. So I'm not too pleased about that. That's reproducing from seed. So some of the weed management technologies we'll talk about today, they're not really that technical in some ways. Some of them: pulling, digging, mulch, thermal weeding, ground covers, selective herbicides, and non-selective herbicides. And each of those topics, we really could talk a long time about each one, but we'll touch upon them very briefly here today. And I'm going to give you some websites to look up. And I know you can't do that very easily from this video or from this webinar. So what we're going to do is put on our Facebook page a list of the websites we're talking about today. And you can go back to the Facebook page and click on those, and they're going to take you to certain places for more information. Okay, so here I am trying to pull out this campanula that I talked about earlier, which is in my rock garden, and it's escaping into my weedy lawn there. And am I going to be successful with that? Not really, because this campanula, not only does it have a rhizome or a spreading root system, it also has a giant root way under the ground that if you take a shovel, you can dig it out, but you really can't pull it out. But in general, of course, gardeners' first option is pulling weeds out, right? We do that constantly. We visit other people's gardens, we see a weed, we pull it out. We can't really help it. It's something we do. So it's always a good idea to pull out a weed. It may not make a long-term impact, but that's kind of our compulsion. And a big point about weeds is that we need to take action before they set seed. And we want to reduce that next generation. Of course, there's something in the soil called the weed seed bank. these weed seeds waiting there to germinate. Some of them can live 5, 10, 15, 20 years as seeds before they germinate. So it's real important to get these plants out of a garden before they set more seed. And it's always, again, trying to get as much of the root as you can. That's just kind of the basic 101 of gardening, I think. So I'm pulling that campanula from down below, and, you know, I'm wishful thinking I'm going to get some of the root out. I might get a little bit. Some weeds, that's enough. You can go on. You can pull a dandelion out after a rainstorm sometimes, but often it's not. So I have another example here of something called the Star of Bethlehem, which sounds wonderful. It's a little white-flowered bulbous plant, which is was planted probably in my property years ago by the first and former owner of my house, and it spreads, and it's cute and nice in some areas, but I don't want it everywhere. So here it is, and if I just pulled this out, I would be doing nothing. So I take my shovel and I do some digging, and I can effectively dig up these clumps of it and get rid of these bulbs here. So if you can dig things up, that is probably, you know, step 2 or much beyond just pulling it as far as effectiveness goes. So again, get to know your plant. If you didn't really know this plant, but you didn't like this foliage, you could pull this out every year, and this is going to outlast you. So get to know what you're pulling out. And of course, having a sharp shovel is a good idea. I had my old trusty normal everyday shovel, which is the one on the right here, kind of a rounded blade. But if I sharpen that with a file, that helps me dig a little bit more effectively. And of course, on the left-hand side is one called the Spearhead Spade, which those of you who came to Spring Garden Day this year maybe knew that we were selling those. They sold out in about 3.5 minutes. They were very popular. I happened to buy one as well, and it's a great shovel for digging out things that have big root systems or are in compacted soil. So you might want to have more than one type of shovel on hand to do your digging. And of course, one of my absolute favorite tools is this soil knife. I really love this soil knife. It's stainless steel. It's got a very sturdy handle. It's almost indestructible, I think. It's got a serrated edge, so I can do some slicing. I can actually saw things with this knife. It has a notch, so you can kind of do a sort of a, I don't know what you call that move, kind of a pruning hook on there. It's just wonderful. And this particular one, 22 bucks, it was worth every penny of it. And I don't work for A.M. Leonard. I don't want to promote them over anybody else, but soil knives are wonderful things. I didn't really have one of these till maybe 10 years ago. And the Master Gardeners gave me this for a holiday present. And I love this thing. You can dig, you can scrape, you can claw. This is just a tool for every moment in the garden. And there's lots of other ones out there. One of the famous ones is called the Hori Hori knife. It has a great name to it. And they're all kind of about in the same price range from when I looked around. So if you don't have a soil knife, that might be a nice investment or a gift for someone. And then a couple other ones which I don't actually own, but Master Gardeners do like. The Cobra Head Weeder has got sort of a graceful curve to the head there and a snake head on the tip. And then the Cape Cod Weeder is more of a right angle tool. And these I think are really good for scratching. I think if you've got gravel and you want to scratch weeds out, these might work. Or if you have a garden where you don't use mulch, but you just have bare soil and you have to scratch a lot of young weeds or seedlings out, these might be very good tools for you. I tend to mulch everything, so I don't really have a lot of bare soil areas. And then I just threw in a couple kind of off-the-wall ones here, just for fun, which I'll just show you for a second here. As far as tools goes, this is called the Dandelion Terminator. You attach this to your drill and stick it in the ground, and the weed wraps around the fork like a spaghetti around a fork, or the weed wraps around the tool like a spaghetti around the fork, and you can slide it off, and your weed is gone. So I don't know how well that would work, but maybe that's a good gift for someone that you would like to keep busy weeding an area, maybe a lawn. And then this one kind of fascinates me. Maybe if anybody here on the call today, or the webinar I should say, has one of these, they can write in the chat box how they think it works. There's a number of these uprooter tools which have a long handle. You stick this in the ground and those claws kind of grip the weed, and you can kind of back it out. There's bigger versions of this called the weed wrench, which I haven't pictured to show you today, but there are a number of these innovative kind of tools which some people do find very useful, especially for getting maybe a woody weed out. You could use one of those uprooter tools. A question we get sometimes is, should I put weeds in my compost pile? And like a lot of gardening questions, we answer it with both a yes and a no. I think if you've got weeds that don't have seeds or reproducible parts, you can put them in your compost pile. If you just have foliage from weeds or maybe very dead weeds, although you got to watch seeds, it's okay to put them in a compost pile, but do be very careful. And really, you don't want to put those bulbs from like that Star of Bethlehem in there. You would never want to put gout weed in your compost pile. You wouldn't want to put any kind of rhizomes. So be very careful about what you put in there, because you know, sometimes these things can lie dormant for quite a number of years and they'll come back to haunt you. I have a little pile off to the side for some of the other nasty things that I can keep an eye on that isn't a compost pile. It's just sort of a weed dead pile. It's way off in the one area of my yard, and I haven't had any escapes from that yet. And maybe you can dispose of things in the trash, but I did have a question recently about that, and make sure you check with your municipality if you're going to be doing a lot of that. It's probably one thing to sneak a little bit of weed seed in the trash, but you don't want to be putting out bags and bags of things like rhizomes from gout weed or something like that in the trash without talking to your municipality or town about it. Okay, and obviously another strategy we have is mulching. So mulching, I think, is a great way to keep down annual weeds, young weeds, things that are moving in. But mulching probably isn't going to solve a weed issue with a perennial weed that's been there a long time. We were talking this week about trying to control a weed called mugwort. And I don't think you're going to mulch your way out of mugwort necessarily, unless maybe you use a very heavy black plastic. So mulch can be very effective in blocking weeds. But again, it also takes a lot of time and money. Think about all the labor that's been expended since the end of maybe April in the United States about putting out mulch, and a lot of money. So think about how big your mulched areas are. I'm trying to make a couple of mine smaller because they do take a lot of effort to mulch every year. Mulch can be very attractive, and of course it's very good for plants because it retains moisture. Maybe it has other benefits as it decomposes. So those are important things. And we have lots of different materials about which we can choose from with mulch. Stone, wood chips, bark, black plastic. And I don't really have time to go into all of those, but if you web browse types and uses of mulch in the Landscape Cornell, you'll come across a good fact sheet that was produced a number of years ago. And I'm going to make a post on the Facebook page of a link to one from, I think it was Oregon, had a really great mulch fact sheet. So not something you think about necessarily a whole lot, but mulch is really an important part of a garden, and what type of mulch you're going to choose to use and how much money you're going to spend on it. And just briefly, we do have a problem with mulch in that some wood mulches will have a small fungus called the artillery fungus, or Sphaerobolus, if you like the scientific name. And this artillery fungus will live on the wood mulch, and it will be able to shoot spores. I believe it's 20 feet. It's a little black dot. And these little black dots end up flying through the air, and they land on cars, patio furniture, house siding, glass, and windows, things like that. And people have lots of trouble with artillery mulch as their, or artillery fungus as their mulch breaks down. So be aware of that. And we've had over the years many conversations about changing out your mulch or not mulching with the same materials because you've got an artillery fungus problem. How about white marble chips? This is an old picture I took many years ago. This is not my favorite mulch, I'll tell you right up front, because as these chips age, they raise the pH of the soil. And in this picture, these are holly plants with a rhododendron that like a low pH, and these white marble chips are going to raise the pH and make it unsuitable for growing any kind of a low pH ericaceous plant. So I've been seeing these make a comeback. I remember these as a kid from the 70s that people would use these. And then it seemed like they went away for a long time. Well, lately I've seen people starting to use these again. And they are going to change your soil chemistry. They will reflect a lot of heat. Not maybe necessarily really great for plants. If you're mulching around a pool and you don't have plants there, maybe white marble chips are the thing to use, but I don't know that they're really good horticulture. Black plastic, now you're going to say, oh, that's really ugly. Well, it's true, it really is ugly. I use it here in my tomato garden as a very practical sort of mulch, but also I wanted to show you this story. This is something I've been working on for a long time, and this is kind of something that a lot of people are going to ask about today. How do I get rid of some of these perennial weeds with rhizomes, and I don't want to use something like glyphosate or Roundup? Well, one of the things I can think of is to use a heavy black plastic layer, leave it on there, and just wait it out. So this is an area I had a lot of expanding lily of the valley in. I have lily of the valley in 2 other places in the garden. I think it's fine, but I didn't want it here because I wanted to grow other things here. So I put this black plastic down in 2018 in the spring. I kind of mowed all the lily of the valley down. I put the black plastic down and I covered it with a leaf mulch. And that's the picture on the left. That was taken in 2020, a few weeks ago. The leaf mulch is breaking down on top of the black plastic. Not a big deal. I can just kind of zhuzh that off and it will be fine. But the picture on the right shows that after 2 years, I have gotten rid of most of the lily of the valley, but not all of the lily of the valley. So I'm waiting another year. I did put mulch on top of this. I'm going to wait out another year. So if you don't want to use an herbicide, but you have time on your side, you could try putting this black plastic down and waiting a long time. And I'm talking years here and seeing how it goes. If lily of the valley popped up in other places, I would just pull it out or dig it out with my soil knife. And I think I'm really going to get the edge on this. Maybe next year I'll be able to look in here and see if I've got any live rhizomes and maybe plant. I really like leaf mulch as a mulch in my garden. Some people think it looks a little shaggy. I have a lot of trees in my woods that blow leaves all over my lawn. I would be raking all of September, October, November, and into December. But I do have this little red machine here, which is a leaf vacuum, that I vacuum the leaves up, it chops the leaves up, and I make free mulch. And I can make yards and yards of free mulch every year. And then I stockpile it in the fall, I move it around in the spring. It decomposes, it adds organic matter, it doesn't cost me a dime, and it's a wonderful thing. So I'm a big fan of making your own leaf mulch. And here's another picture. This was an area that I treated with black plastic, left it on for 3 years to remove something called Siberian aster, and I just recently replanted this with hostas because I believe the Siberian aster is gone. So wait it out with your black plastic. And I just saw this scenario a few weeks ago in April. I was in a conservation area and they were trying to use a similar technique. They had put down a heavy-duty landscape fabric over Japanese knotweed. And it clearly had not succeeded because the Japanese knotweed, you can see in the picture there, is poking up through a crack in the impenetrable, otherwise impenetrable weed fabric. So if you can't do this and walk away, don't use this technique and think you're going to be home free anytime soon. You've got to be on top of it. Had they been more vigilant here to keep these seams sewed up, so to speak, would they have kept the knotweed out? I don't know. Because if you're going to try to control Japanese knotweed with even Roundup or glyphosate, you're going to need to do it multiple times. So this is one of the world's toughest weeds here. And if we put down a weed barrier and walk away, we're not going to do a whole lot of good. Okay, so that does bring me to landscape fabrics very briefly. Good or not so good? Well, I think they have their place, but weeds can grow on top of them. Weeds can go through them. So you really have to be vigilant if you do use landscape fabrics. I've seen many situations where they'll put down a landscape fabric and then mulch on top of it over and over again, and the mulch breaks down into a substrate where the weeds can grow, or the weeds put roots down through the landscape fabric, and you can really eventually just have a mess. So don't think this is a walk away, one effort solution, because it can make gardening actually more difficult. And if you do have plants that you want to have spread, this can hinder their spreading. So it's, you know, something we can use in certain situations maybe. One of the links I'll give you is to Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott's Horticultural Myths, and she talks about weed fabric. She's a great researcher out, I believe, in Washington State or Oregon, out in the Pacific Northwest. She's got a really great website, which I'll share with you about all sorts of things in horticulture. And she does talk about landscape fabric. Just a moment about thermal weeding. One of these things that has fascinated me for a long time, using some sort of a flame or heat to reduce weeds. So how does that work? Well, very briefly, we're going to use heat to kill the vegetation. It will be very quick, and we're going to be wilting, really, instead of incinerating. So the people that do this, this kind of started with vegetable growers that were growing organically. They didn't want to use a lot of herbicides, so they have a lot of interest in using flames instead. And they talk about just wilting the weeds. You don't have to burn it into oblivion, is what they tell us. So if you're going to be using these, don't feel like you have to be hovering over the weed completely until it burns to a crisp. You can kind of wilt them and you'll save propane. I imagine that's kind of a skill that you get. It's most effective on annuals, and the perennial weeds with the bigger root systems are going to need a little bit of retreatment. The observation's been that grasses are harder to kill than broadleaf weeds. Grasses tend to be very tough plants, and many of them are adapted to fire. So they are capable of withstanding, you know, some thermal weeding or flames, and then they can regrow very well. And the vegetable growers that use this technique say that you get different weeds over time. Sometimes if you plant seeds for vegetables, you can flame over the top before the vegetables emerge. That's being very creative there. And I think some of the safety stuff really bears a mention here. We got to use reliable equipment for operator safety, and the operator really has to be very careful to avoid fire. So don't go into this lightly, but these are sold locally. One of our master gardeners told me about her experience, and she says it's great for her sidewalk and patio and reduces how much she has to bend over to weed. So certainly in places with hardscaping, this might really work very well. Gravel areas, driveways, sidewalks, this could be a very good way to go for some people. But again, be very careful. Right now, the weather has been very dry. We don't want to have any 6 o'clock news incidents where a gardener burns down their backyard because they were using a flame weeder. I also got to thinking about plants that work for us and ground covers. And two that I just happen to like that I have a lot of in my garden are hostas and this ostrich fern. These guys crowd out the weeds. So maybe we can be smarter with our plantings in certain areas in our garden and plant things that are going to really work for us and crowd out the weeds. So the hosta on the left is a plain green hosta. Most people would say, why would you grow that? It's not very attractive. Not fancy leaves, at least. I think it's very attractive, actually. And what I do with these plain green hostas is I let them go to flower, and I let them go to seed. And I let those seeds mature on the plant, and those seeds fall down, and I get more hostas. So the hostas are spreading, and I was inspired by visiting Oakwood Cemetery one time years ago, and there was a huge patch of hosta just growing there, obviously planted from, or originated from one hosta somebody had planted many decades before, but the hosta was making its own ground cover. So I like hosta, it grows well for me. I'm letting it go to seed and spread. So it's a good spreader. And the ostrich fern is kind of the same thing. I have a very dry, shady area. I planted one ostrich fern, it's spreading. You can see there's some jewel weed trying to come up in there, and that comes up a little bit, but I don't get a whole lot of other weeds in this fern patch. So the ferns are not a weed yet. The ferns are being a ground cover. Of course, sometimes there is a fine line, but make the plants work for you and outcompete the weeds. So that brings us to our final section here, which we'll kind of go over, and that is herbicide. So herbicides obviously are chemicals that we use to kill plants. and they can be of many different types. So I'll just give you a little background here to start. We talk about herbicides that are broad spectrum or non-selective, and those are herbicides that are going to kill a wide range of plants. And then we have selective herbicides, and they tend to kill only a smaller portion of the plant world. Okay, and plants can be resistant for a number of different reasons to herbicide, and that gets kind of complicated, but just know that some herbicides are going to be broad spectrum and some are going to be more selective. We have different formulations for homeowners. You can buy herbicides that are liquids you might mix up in a little sprayer that you have, or maybe you buy one of these fancy ready-to-use jugs with a little spray gun on it. Or you can buy granular herbicides. That tends to be something we use on lawns, sometimes in landscape beds as well. Also, herbicides can be pre-emergent or post-emergent. When we talk about pre-emergent herbicides, those are materials we put down usually in the spring to control weeds before they germinate. And I'll touch upon that a little bit more. Post-emergent just means we're going to use an herbicide on the plant when the plant is sitting there and it's green and it's growing. So that's all that term really means. People get concerned about herbicides. They don't want to do environmental damage, which I certainly understand, but do know that herbicides are very heavily regulated. These are not things that are just put on a shelf or come in from overseas, as we see some things coming in. These are very regulated products, and it's the US EPA on the federal level that regulates herbicides and all pesticides really, and the New York State DEC on the state level. And New York is one of course, the most strict states when it comes to these type of products. So you might go someplace else in the country and find that they're using some product that we don't have here in New York because our authorities have decided that we don't want to take the risk that that poses. So we do have a lot of regulation. And of course, the best thing you can do is read the label. Of course, whenever you do a talk about pesticides, you have to say that, but it really is true. There's a lot of great information on the pesticide label. Read it before you buy it. Read it before you are thinking about using it, because you might change your mind or find that the product really isn't the right fit. And certainly the information about how to use it, safety precautions are going to be on the label. Okay, a note about selective herbicides just before we go any further. Some of them, in broad terms here, will kill monocots, and some of them will kill dicots. Okay, so what are monocots? Well, monocots are grasses, things like lilies, corn, oats, any of those kind of plants. And then dicots, or broadleaf plants, are just about everything else. And I have a picture of a plant called velvet leaf there. That's a dicot or a broadleaf plant. Ground ivy is a broadleaf plant. An oak tree is a broadleaf plant. There's many of those. So when we talk about herbicides being selective, sometimes an herbicide will be one that kills only monocots, and sometimes an herbicide might be something that kills only dicots, or the broadleaf plants. And this is what really made modern lawn care possible, because lawns are grassy plants, monocots, and for the most part, people that want to have a really upscale lawn don't want to have broadleaf plants in it, so they would use a broadleaf or a dicot type of herbicide, we could say, that would kill those type of plants and make just a lawn of grasses. Okay, now timing is important. I guess timing is important for a lot of things in life, but there's usually an optimal time to use an herbicide for each weed, and often that's the fall, but not always. So make sure you learn about your weed. And why is the fall a good time to use an herbicide? Because it's being translocated down to the root system, if it is indeed an herbicide that does translocate. So if you're trying to kill something with a big root system, and you're going to use something that will translocate, an herbicide that will move down into the plant, it's often a good time to do it in the fall. And that's why I have a picture of a dahlia here in the fall time, because that will be an opportunity to kill the root system better. If you use some of these herbicides in the spring, they're not as effective. So timing is very important. That may be found on the label, or it may be found by reading a few more fact sheets from Cooperative Extension about timing of herbicides. So again, check your list of weeds you're working with and when the best time to work with them is. And also weather is important. We've had really dry weather. This was taken a couple weeks ago in Sand Lake. It's probably even worse looking there now with dryness and the turf grass browning out there. But a lot of times herbicides don't work particularly well when it's so dry because the plants don't take them up very well and the plants are not actively growing. So it may be a difficult time. And also some herbicides don't work particularly well when it's hot out. So be very careful with temperature as well. Just a note about what you should wear. I always see people wearing a lot of flip-flops these days, so this is why I put this in here. Don't wear flip-flops when you're using herbicide. For category 3 and 4 products, which are the things that homeowners can use, you should wear long sleeves, long pants, shoes. Ideally, rubber boots would be what the authorities would say, but shoes of some sort, no open-toed sandals or flip-flops. You want to just keep yourself covered up. Do you need a dust mask? Well, if you're doing this by social distancing, you don't need a mask, right? We could say that. I would wear a dust mask if I was using a granular product that had to be very dusty when I poured it into my spreader or something like that. But otherwise, I probably wouldn't wear a dust mask, but I definitely would wear gloves. And what kind of gloves would I wear? Cotton? I hope nobody says yes. Leather? I hope nobody says yes, because those are going to absorb any kind of herbicide that I spill on them. We want to use chemical-resistant gloves like nitrile, butyl, neoprene, things like that, okay? Natural rubber isn't always the best, and the picture here shows gloves that are not acceptable. The white ones are leather gloves, not acceptable, and the dark ones are kind of rubber and fabric. I wouldn't wear those to use to apply herbicide. So just keep yourself covered up. This stuff is not as powerful as the stuff that the professionals use. What is sold to homeowners is really not as potent in its formulation as what some of the professional folks will use. So we do want to keep ourselves covered up though when we use an herbicide. So let's talk a little bit more about these and give some examples. The first one here is a pre-emergent herbicide. If you have a lawn that's very thin and has weeds growing in it that are annuals, like crabgrass, you might use this pre-emergent herbicide on your lawn. And my picture here shows a very thin lawn and some crabgrass germinating there. And I'll show you a closer picture in a second, but that's the scenario here. What could you do? Well, I would say, you know, fertilize your lawn a little bit, try to overseed it, try to get it denser so then you might not need to use herbicide. But if you do need to use herbicide, you might use a pre-emergent herbicide. It's applied early in the spring, about the time that forsythia blooms, before these weed seeds germinate. And here's just a very short list of some of the ones that are legal in New York. So you might go to a store and find several different types there, but they're all going to do the same thing. They're going to block the weeds from germinating for a period of about 6 to 16 weeks. And then after that, they kind of wear off and the weeds can move back in. The two that are in red of the list are Siduron and Siduron, I should say, and mesotrione. Those are the only ones you can use on a newly seeded area. So if you were going to plant a lawn in the spring from seed and you wanted to put out something that would manage some of the weeds that would move in, you could use either of those products. But of course, we all know it's better to seed a lawn in the fall when the grass is going to germinate better and the weed seeds are going to be less likely to germinate. So this is the situation that a lot of people do in the spring with lawns. They do use a lot of fertilizer and herbicide combinations, so read your label and make sure you know what you've got in that package before you use it and buy it. And again, the rule of thumb is that these last about 6 to 16 weeks. So there's my crabgrass that's germinating in my lawn, or is coming up, and it's in a couple leaf stage there. And it's going to become that large crabgrass plant, which is going to make a lot of weed seeds by the end of the summer. So that's just what happens with the annual weeds. But again, another day we could talk about overseeding your lawn in the fall, and you could avoid using any of this pre-emergent herbicide. So that's another strategy here. There are pre-emergent herbicides for landscape beds. One of them is called trifluralin. It's often sold under the names of Treflan or Preen. This is sold in garden centers very widely. You can sprinkle this on to a landscape bed, and it will keep out, again, annual weeds around perennial plants, around shrubs and things like that. You don't want to use it near any seeds that you've planted, though, and you want to read the label to make sure you can use it around the plants that are in your garden. But some people will use these granules to control weeds around their plants and landscape beds. The labels will talk about this can be applied on top of mulch. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, because the mulch should be keeping the weeds out, but the label will tell you that's okay to do. And the label will also say probably that you should water it in, because then it will release and start to work. Okay, and one of the most famous of the pre-emergent herbicides turned out to be corn gluten, which is a powder, a granular product, and was sold as a pre-emergent. It's a byproduct of the corn processing industry, and initially it was claimed that it provided control of a long list of annual and perennial weeds, and it could be used in lawns and landscape beds. For a number of years this was popular. I don't know if people are still really using it, but there was a lot of research done on it after it came out, and Frank Rossi, our Cornell turfgrass extension specialist, talked about how he believed that mostly it was an effect of providing a lot of nitrogen and having the lawn outgrow the weeds, and that it really wasn't terribly effective. And Dr. Chalker Scott from Washington State, who we quoted before, talked about how she could not find any real scientific evidence that this worked on weeds. So corn gluten's kind of fallen out of favor, I guess. Let's talk for a minute about some selective herbicides. These are often things like 2,4-D, MCPP, dicamba, okay? These can be used in spring or fall. They'll manage a large number of broadleaf weeds, things like plantain, let's see, dandelion, things like that will be controlled by these herbicides. They're used on lawns very extensively, and also they're very widely sold in local stores. So very popular materials. They come in liquid and granular formulations, but you should be careful. And the picture I have here shows a tree that has been damaged by drift. If you use some of these products and it gets very hot out, say 85 or 90 degrees, these can do what's called volatilize, that's a big word, and they will damage the tree by a vapor. So read your label very carefully. This was a situation we saw a couple years ago where these spruce trees were damaged. So use these with caution. I made some plots here to show you what happens. On the left is a picture of a very weedy plot with a lot of plantain in it, and I applied a small square of 2,4-D and dicamba herbicide there, and you can see after 1 week that plot is starting to turn yellow and the leaves are starting to twist on the weeds. And then, whoops, if I can get this to move, for some reason it's not working anymore. Oh, there we go. You'll start to see the weeds will die after about a week. And you can see this twisting here on the plantain and the discoloration, the purpling of the leaves. So this is the way you would get rid of these weeds in a lawn. And the grass is unaffected because 2,4-D is a selective herbicide. So the lawn will have its grass, but it won't have its weeds anymore. One we get a lot of questions about, of course, is ground ivy. And if you look for a product with 2,4-D in it plus triclopyr, that's the best one to manage ground ivy in a lawn with. And also the best time of the year to do it is in the fall when the ground ivy is translocating its sugars and nutrients down to the root system. Triclopyr will also be an herbicide that you can use on poison ivy as just an aside. So that's how we would do that in a lawn. Now, people that were concerned about 2,4-D wanted an alternative, so I have one here for you today. It's called the iron herbicide. FIESTA is one of the brand names here. And iron is an element that's out in the environment. It's very common. We all have iron in our systems, but the thing about iron is that broadleaf weeds will absorb it and slowly die, whereas grasses can tolerate iron. So somebody figured that fact out, and they've packaged this up in a liquid form, and you mix up this iron, spray it on your weeds, the grasses will survive, and the broadleaf weeds will die. So this company called FIESTA or Engage Agro is one of the ones that put this out first. There's other brands out there of this that you can look for. It does have a lot of good attributes to it. It's something you can reseed into on a lawn very quickly. You can use it on a new lawn after 7 days. The pets and the people can enter the area after it dries. It's very environmentally benign. So here's some pictures that we did a few years ago. On the left is a plot that we sprayed on June 8th and June 21st that had a lot of different types of weeds in it. So we used 2 applications, and then by July 12th, you can see we get rid of probably about 80% to 85% of the weeds. Here's a plot that we sprayed on August 24th and September 13th. Had mostly weeds in it, very little grass, but you can see the grass survived, and we got rid of probably, again, about 80% of the weeds. Here's not such great pictures I have of clover. Now, I like clover, so I wouldn't spray clover, but if you sprayed clover with the iron herbicide, you reduced it greatly. And even ground ivy would succumb to some degree to the iron herbicide. So if you don't want to use the 2,4-D and some of the other mainstream chemicals, the iron herbicide might be something that you would be interested in. It does take multiple treatments, so you're going to be kind of committed to trying to manage the weeds using that in that way. So it's kind of a longer term project. And then there's some question about how effective it is in the long term. Will some of the weeds return? You might get some grow back, but again, if you're really dedicated to this, you probably can really reduce your weeds over time with the iron herbicide. Just a side note here, a specialty herbicide people ask us about this thing called common yellow nut sedge in their lawn. There's really only 1 or 2 herbicides that will work on that selectively and leave the grass alone. And that product is called sedge hammer or halosulfuron. And that has to be used when the sedge is 3 to 8 leaves. After that, it's too big and it won't really work very well. Also, nut sedge, don't pull it, because if you pull it, it just releases the little nutlets on the root system and it will grow back. So if you can dig it out, that's probably a better way to go. Okay, and then just to wrap up here very briefly, we'll talk about some non-selective herbicides. Again, these are products that are going to kill a wide range of plants. So we do have to be really careful with these in our gardens. We don't want to get these on plants that we want to save. There's a wide number of different types of these. I have a list here. Acetic acid, vinegar will kill a lot of different plants. Pelargonic acid or soap, clove oil, cinnamon oil, or citric acid, I should say, and glyphosate or Roundup. They all kind of have this thing in common that they're broad spectrum or non-selective herbicides, and they kill by, well, some of them kill by destroying the leaf epidermis in the cells. I should say that Roundup kills by inhibiting photosynthesis. So just a moment on Roundup here. Generally kills a lot of different types of plants, but some plants it doesn't kill quite as well. There are some weeds that have become resistant, but mostly those are in agriculture. So Roundup is still widely sold and widely available. It does have some controversial aspects to it, and we'll post a link on our Facebook site of a discussion that one of our Cornell researchers has in PowerPoint form about Roundup and all the controversy about it. Roundup does work very well, you have to give it that. Here's a square of lawn I sprayed Roundup on, or glyphosate, which is the chemical name here. And you can see after 24 hours it's starting to turn brown. The weeds are starting to wilt as well as the grass. And 1 week after that, the whole plot has turned brown and is dead. So this is a herbicide that's fairly powerful, so you have to be careful how you use it. It will kill a wide range of different plants, so use it carefully. And again, it's still widely sold, and if you have questions about it, I would go look at that PowerPoint that we'll post up. People are very interested in alternatives to Roundup, of course, and we'll post this link too. There's a nice list that was made by our weed scientist, Andy Senesac, down on Long Island, and he has a discussion of these alternatives to glyphosate or Roundup. And if you want to, you can web browse that by typing in alternatives to glyphosate, which is a mouthful, and Cornell. So what are these products? Well, these are generally environmentally benign. These tend to be reduced risk products, so they're a little safer for the environment than some of our other products. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be careful with them. They can be eye irritants, and you don't want to breathe in the vapors from some of them, but they are good products because they will kill weeds, especially young weeds. So Here's one that I have had quite a bit of experience with. This is called Pelargonic acid. One of the brand names is called Scythe. This is a great alternative to Roundup if you're trying to kill weeds in cracks, in gravel driveways, in sidewalks, places like that, because these weeds tend to be shallow rooted and tend to be fairly easy to control. So the herbicidal soap, this will do a very good job on these small weeds, annual weeds, weeds that don't have a big root system, okay? And they'll just burn it back, and it's very easy to use kind of product. Now here's my weedy lawn again. So I sprayed a square of this pelargonic acid or herbicidal soap, and one day after, you can see it's burned back the foliage very nicely. That looks like I did a whole lot of work there. But what happens, because most of these weeds in the lawn and the lawn grasses are perennials and they have a good root system, after about a week, this starts to grow back. So on perennial plants, this doesn't work quite as well. And in 2 weeks, I see my plantain starting to come back. So you're not going to really kill persistent weeds with some of these products, pelargonic acid being one of them, okay? And the same goes for acetic acid. Vinegar is 5% acetic acid. Most of the products you're going to buy that are vinegar herbicide or acetic acid herbicide are going to be 20%. Back in 2001, we did a little research project on this, and it's still on our website at ccerensselaer.org. You can go look that one up. But basically, the acetic acid will work very similarly to what I just showed you with the soap herbicide. It'll burn the foliage back. The 20% works better than just vinegar that you might see people talking about on the internet as kind of a homemade herbicide. That'll burn back small weeds, but it won't work too terribly well on the perennial weeds. None of these work as well as glyphosate, unfortunately. And really it depends on how often you use it and the capability of the weed, really, how durable the weed is. So again, these are good for sidewalk areas, cracks and crevices, gravel driveways, places like that. So in wrapping up, I'm going to show you my short list of weeds here and what I'm doing about them. So first off, I've got my plantain that I complained about in the beginning, and my plantain there has been sprayed with the iron herbicide, and I'm going to probably do that 2 or 3 times over the summer and see if I can reduce my plantain population by using the iron herbicide. And then I'm going to do overseeding, which I'll probably talk about on another one of our webinars one day in the fall. So that's a strategy for the plantain. The garlic mustard, which I alluded to in the beginning as being in my woods, I pull that out by hand. So I'm a dedicated hand puller outer of garlic mustard, especially before it goes to seed. And really the pelargonic acid, believe it or not, does pretty well on the first year rosette of these. So what happens with the garlic mustard is that the first year it's a small clump of leaves, and the pelargonic acid or the herbicidal soap will kill that. So I don't need to use Roundup on that, and I get some good control with that. But I do pull out garlic mustard anytime I see it. That weedy campanula that I have in my rock garden, there's a picture of that. It's growing in my really nice bed of sedum. Now I really love sedum, and here's this campanula growing through it, which I really don't want. So I'm going to have to resort to some of the stronger stuff there. And the gentleman in the picture is using something called a weed wiper. So you can put an herbicide in that weed wiper. It's got an end on it like a paint roller, and you could just touch the leaves of the campanula. And if you don't get the herbicide on the lower leaves down on the ground of the sedum, you're just going to kill the campanula. Or you could use the paintbrush method. So here I took my paintbrush and I took some Roundup or glyphosate and I painted it on the leaves of this campanula, and I'm hoping that this is going to kill it. And I didn't hurt my sedum at all, and I only used a very little bit of glyphosate. So that's a very targeted method of using an herbicide. And this is kind of my crazy experiment here. This tall thing called the birthwort, or the Aristolochia weed that is spreading by rhizomes. What I took was a piece of my leaf blower, which I never use, which is kind of a tube. I put it around that plant, and then I sprayed a little herbicide on it. So I'm using a guard. And if you read some of the weed control recommendations on the internet, they talk about using a guard or a shield if you have to spray a plant that's close to something you don't want to get herbicide on. And another thing I'm going to allude to here is that the waxy surface of these leaves of this weed really let the herbicide roll right off. So I use something called a surfactant, which is basically like a soap. And if I use a little bit of that in my mix, it will penetrate the leaves much better, and I get very good control of it. So that's a whole lot of different aspects of weeds there. And well, I went a lot longer than I wanted to, but here we are. And I hope a few people have made it to the end here with us today.